The operational picture changed in the last 24 hours in ways that the previous 13 days of this conflict did not fully anticipate. And the change is not incremental, it is structural. Iran executed a coordinated multi-front assault overnight that struck at least 3 distinct theaters simultaneously. A missile strike hit the town of Seir in northern Israel, located in the Lower Galilee region. 58 people confirmed wounded, according to the Magen David Adom ambulance service. A KC-135 refueling tanker belonging to the United States Air Force was destroyed over Iraq, with 4 crew members reported killed. And a drone struck a French military installation in Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, killing 1 French soldier and wounding several others. 3 strikes, 3 separate theaters, 3 different target categories: Israeli civilian population, American air mobility assets, and French military personnel, all within a 24-hour window, all claimed by Iranian-aligned forces, all occurring on the same night that the IRGC announced the 41st wave of Operation True Promise 4, describing 5 hours of continuous fire against more than 50 Israeli targets in a single night. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a streak of independent operational decisions made by separate actors without coordination. This is a saturation strategy being executed across multiple simultaneous axes, and the analytical implications of what happened in the last 24 hours are more significant than any single development of the previous 2 weeks. Subscribe to From Report right now and turn on notifications. The multi-front coordination demonstrated overnight marks a qualitative shift in the operational character of this conflict that requires analysis beyond the individual strike reports. The strike on SSIA deserves specific geographic and strategic attention because its location says something important about where the operational reach of this conflict has now arrived. SSIA is not a border community. It is not a settlement in the immediate vicinity of Lebanon or Gaza that might be expected to fall within the range of Hezbollah rocket fire or Hamas operations. It is located in the Lower Galilee region, considerably further into Israeli territory than the zones that have historically defined the geographic boundary of crossbird strikes. 58 people were wounded in what the Magen David Adom service described as a significant projectile impact event. Israeli officials stated their defensive systems intercepted the majority of incoming threats. The images circulating from the strike site tell a different story than the official characterization, one that the Israeli public sheltering overnight in bomb shelters across the country experienced directly, regardless of what the official damage assessment says. The significance of a strike reaching deep into the Galilee is not primarily about the specific casualty count from this particular event. It is about what the geographic reach demonstrates regarding the operational parameters within which this conflict is now being conducted, the traditional implicit boundaries that defined where Iran and its proxy network would and would not strike, the unwritten rules that kept the conflict contained within certain geographic and target category limits have been progressively dissolved since the February 28 opening strikes eliminated the supreme leader. What remained of those boundaries after the assassination of Khamenei appears to have been formally abandoned in the operational planning that produced last night's assault. The 5 hours of continuous fire that the IRGC described, generating strikes against more than 50 Israeli targets, required a level of coordination, logistics management, and sustained operational tempo that is inconsistent with a force operating at the degraded capacity that American officials have been publicly describing. The Secretary of Defense stated the day before these strikes that Iran had been reduced to a fraction of its former capability, that its navy was gone, its military infrastructure dismantled, its missile stockpiles exhausted. Within hours of that characterization being published, 50 targets were struck in Israel across a 5-hour operational window. The timing of that sequence is analytically significant. Either the official capability assessment was inaccurate, or the capability being demonstrated in the field belongs to a force that was not included in that assessment. The KC-135 loss in Iraq requires the same analytical treatment that this channel applied when the first tanker went down, because the official explanation and the operational reality are describing the same event in incompatible terms. CENTCOM's characterization of the loss described the aircraft as having crashed, The framing of crashed rather than shot down is doing specific institutional work. An aircraft that crashed may have experienced a mechanical failure, a navigation error, a weather event, or any number of non-hostile causes. An aircraft that was shot down was engaged by a hostile force and destroyed. The distinction between those two descriptions carries enormous implications for the official narrative of Iranian military capability and for the domestic political consequences of acknowledging the operational reality that American aircraft are being successfully engaged and destroyed by Iranian-aligned forces. The Islamic Resistance in Iraq, a coalition of Iranian-aligned armed factions operating in the country, claimed the attack before CENTCOM issued its characterization. Armed factions do not claim attacks that did not occur. Their credibility with their own base, their fundraising, their recruitment, and their political standing within the Iranian proxy network all depend on the accuracy of their operational claims. Falsely claiming a successful strike against a major American military platform would be institutionally self-destructive for an organization whose power derives from its demonstrated capacity to conduct effective operations. They claimed it because they conducted it. The pattern of CENTCOM explanations for American aircraft losses in this conflict has now produced a sequence that strains analytical credibility beyond the point where continued acceptance is intellectually defensible. 4 combat aircraft were lost in Kuwait, attributed to friendly fire incidents. A KC-135 was previously destroyed, characterized as a crash. Now a second KC-135 has been lost, characterized as a crash. The statistical probability of multiple major American military aircraft being lost to non-hostile causes within the same short conflict in the same operational theater, while Iranian-aligned forces are conducting sustained offensive operations specifically targeting American air assets, while those same forces are publicly claiming credit for the losses, approaches zero. The official explanations are not credible, and the cumulative pattern of those explanations is itself an analytical data point about the institutional decision to manage domestic perception of this conflict's costs at the expense of accurate public accounting. The question of crew size is also worth raising directly. The KC-135 Stratotanker is not a small aircraft. It is one of the largest and most complex air refueling platforms in the American inventory, requiring a crew train to manage its fuel transfer systems, navigation, communications, and emergency procedures in addition to basic aircraft operation. The official report of 4 crew members killed prompts the question of whether the full crew complement aboard was accurately characterized in the official statement, not as an accusation, but as a point of analytical attention in a conflict where the official accounting of American casualties has consistently trailed the operational reality documented through other sources. The strike against the French military installation in Erbil introduces a dimension that this channel has been tracking as a potential escalatory threshold since France deployed the Child de Bauer carrier group to the theater weeks ago. A French soldier is dead. Several others are wounded. President Macron described the attack as unacceptable, the diplomatic vocabulary that governments use when they are signaling that a response is being considered without committing to its form or timeline. France is a NATO member. The collective defense provisions of the North Atlantic Treaty, the framework under which an attack on one member constitutes an attack on all, are now technically implicated by an Iranian-aligned forces killing of a French soldier on Iraqi territory. The militia that claimed the attack on the French installation had previously issued explicit threats against French interests in the region, citing France's military presence in support of American operations. The claim was not anonymous, and it was not ambiguous. It identified French forces as legitimate targets because of their operational relationship with the American coalition conducting strikes against Iran. The analytical significance of the French soldier's death extends beyond the immediate casualty count. It marks the first confirmed killing of a NATO member nation soldier by Iranian-aligned forces in this conflict. That threshold, the killing of a French military member as opposed to a non-NATO allied force member, carries specific treaty implications that the killing of American or Israeli soldiers does not trigger in the same institutional framework. Whether France responds militarily, whether NATO's collective defense mechanism is formally invoked, whether the killing produces the escalatory consequence of drawing a major European military power more directly into an active theatre, those questions are now on the table in a way they were not 24 hours ago. The unwritten rules that govern this conflict's escalatory parameters have been dissolved one by one. Hezbollah was characterized as degraded beyond functional military capacity, then demonstrated 5-hour coordinated strike operations against 50 Israeli targets. Iranian missile capability was described as exhausted, then delivered strikes reaching deep into the Galilee. American aircraft were characterized as losses from friendly fire and mechanical failure. Then Iranian-aligned forces claimed each one. French military personnel were implicitly assumed to be protected by the deterrent weight of NATO membership. Then a French soldier was killed in Erbil by a militia that explicitly targeted French interests. The multi-front coordination that last night's operations demonstrated is the development that carries the most significant analytical weight because it reveals the operational architecture of what Iran has been building toward since the February 28th opening strikes. This is no longer a bilateral conflict between Iran and the American-Israeli coalition. It is a worked proxy war being conducted across 7 simultaneous fronts in multiple countries by a coordinated force structure that shares targeting intelligence, operational timing, charge and strategic objectives while maintaining the tactical independence that makes it difficult to respond to one front without creating vulnerabilities on others. Hezbollah in Lebanon is conducting strike operations into northern Israel, reaching further into Israeli territory than previous conflict cycles have documented. Iraqi Shia militia factions are engaging American air assets in Iraqi airspace and have now killed a soldier from a third-party NATO member nation on Iraqi territory. Houthi forces in Yemen are maintaining pressure on maritime routes in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. Iranian ballistic and cruise missile forces are conducting direct strikes against Israeli military infrastructure. IRGC drone units are maintaining operational pressure across the Gulf theater. The coordination between these components, demonstrated by the simultaneous timing of last night's strikes across 3 distinct theaters, reflects a level of command, control, and communications integration that the official characterization of Iranian military capability as degraded and exhausted cannot account for. The concept of a saturation strategy, the deliberate application of simultaneous pressure across more axes than the defensive architecture can simultaneously address, is what this coordinated multi-front operation is designed to execute. When you force a defender to allocate interceptors, air cover, intelligence attention, and command bandwidth across 7 simultaneous fronts in multiple countries at the same time, you create vulnerabilities on every front that could not exist if the pressure were applied sequentially. The Arrow system, David Sling, and Iron Dome cannot be in the same place at the same time. The intelligence community cannot maintain the same quality of real-time situational awareness across Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, the Gulf, and central Israel simultaneously that it can maintain against a single concentrated threat. The logistics and communications infrastructure required to coordinate defensive responses across that geographic span creates its own vulnerabilities that the offensive coordination is specifically designed to exploit. What last night demonstrated is that the proxy network Iran has been building and maintaining for decades, the investment in Hezbollah's military capacity in Iraqi Shia militia organization and armament in healthy operational capability, was not primarily a deterrence architecture. It was an offensive architecture designed to be activated in exactly this scenario. When Iran faces an existential military threat that its own forces cannot address on a single front, the proxy network becomes the force multiplier that converts a bilateral conflict into a multi-front war that the opposing coalition cannot manage with the same operational efficiency. The official characterization of this conflict's trajectory from the American and Israeli side has now accumulated a credibility deficit that the operational record makes impossible to ignore. The day before last night's strikes, the Secretary of Defense stated publicly that Iran had been reduced to a shadow of its former military capability, that its navy was gone, its military infrastructure systematically dismantled, its missile stockpiles critically depleted. That characterization was published across American media as the authoritative assessment of Iranian capability on day 14 of this conflict. Within hours of that characterization being published, the 41st wave of Iranian operations struck more than 50 targets in Israel across 5 consecutive hours. A KC-135 was destroyed in Iraq. A French soldier was killed in Erbil. 58 people were wounded in a strike that reached into the lower Galilee. That sequence, the official capability assessment, followed immediately by the operational demonstration that contradicts it, is not an isolated communications failure. It is a pattern that has repeated throughout this conflict. Iranian capacity has been described as degraded, exhausted, and approaching military irrelevance at multiple points across 16 days, while the operational record simultaneously documents sustained 54-wave offensive operations, precision strikes against American naval assets, the destruction of Ben Gurion International Airport, the forced withdrawal of American forces from Gulf forward positions, and now a coordinated multi-front assault that killed personnel from 3 separate countries in a single night. The gap between official capability assessments and operational outcomes is not a communications problem. It is a strategic problem because the decisions being made on the American and Israeli side about escalation, negotiation, force deployment, and political commitment are being made by people who either believe their own capability assessments and are therefore working from an inaccurate strategic picture, or do not believe them and are communicating them anyway for domestic political reasons. Neither possibility supports confidence in the decision-making process that is determining the trajectory of a conflict with consequences that extend to energy markets, food supply chains, and the economic lives of hundreds of millions of people who had no voice in the decision that started it. The broader strategic question that last night's multi-front operation raises is one that every government watching this conflict is now calculating with fresh urgency. The conflict that began on February 28 as a described as brief American-Israeli operation against Iranian nuclear infrastructure has now killed military personnel from the United States, Israel, France, and Iran. It has displaced 3.22 million Iranians and 800,000 Lebanese. It has destroyed Israel's only international airport. It has closed the Strait of Hormuz to Western commercial shipping for more than 2 weeks. It has cut Kuwait's oil production by more than half. It has paralyzed Qatar's LNG exports and eliminated 80% of Europe's traditional gas supply. It has forced the withdrawal of American forces from Gulf forward positions across Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and the UAE. It has killed a French soldier on Iraqi territory, implicating NATO's collective defense framework for the first time. And it has produced no declared objective achieved, no ceasefire framework, no functioning exit strategy, and no honest public accounting of what it has cost and what it has produced. The unwritten rules that kept this conflict operating within implicit boundaries are gone. The assumption that proxy forces would be constrained by their patrons' interest in avoiding direct NATO member casualties is gone. The characterization of Iranian military capability as approaching exhaustion is contradicted by every operational development of the past 24 hours. And the saturation strategy being executed across 7 simultaneous fronts is placing demands on the American-Israeli defensive architecture that the force structure available in this theater not designed to meet simultaneously. Well, nobody has a plan that the last 24 hours supports. The plan that was supposed to conclude this conflict in 48 hours is on day 16. The force multiplier that the Iranian proxy network represents has now been demonstrated at full operational scale. And the question of what happens next, whether France invokes NATO mechanisms, whether the marine deployment proceeds into an environment that last night's operations have made more hostile than the deployment decision accounted for, whether the ceasefire back channels can produce movement before the next wave arrives, is a question that the operational record of the last 24 hours has made considerably harder to answer optimistically than it was before Sar Erbil and Iraq happened in the same night. Subscribe to From Report and turn on notifications. When the French government's response to the killing of its soldier in Her will take shape, when NATO's institutional reaction to the death of a member nation's military personnel clarifies, when the 42nd wave launches and its targets reveal what the IRGC is prioritizing in the next operational phase, the analysis will be here. This channel documents the gap between official characterization and operational reality, connects the military and economic and diplomatic dimensions that daily coverage keeps artificially separate, and tells you what the assembled evidence actually shows. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you always.